One Saturday afternoon in November of 1990, a 26-year-old kindergarten teacher named Sue Lixia sat crying on a bench at a train station in the city of Naha, which is located in northeastern China. Sue had just left her husband for good. They'd had a bad marriage for a long time. It was very contentious. They fought all the time. And that morning, they had gotten into this major fight. And for Sue, it was kind of like the final straw. And so she just stormed into the bedroom, grabbed some things, threw it in a bag, and just stormed out. She was done. But Sue really didn't have a plan for what she was going to do once she left the house. And so she found herself just sitting at this train station doing nothing, just staring at the trains rolling in and out over and over again. And as she sat there, again, not knowing what she's going to do, she suddenly took stock of the fact that very few people were getting on and off of these trains. And in fact, the train station itself was weirdly vacant. So the city of Naha, where Sue was actually fairly small by China's standards, even though there was 70,000 people that lived there. The city sat at the base of this towering mountain, and then all around the city in the outskirts was basically just farmland with lots of soy and corn crops. And then as you move closer to the city center, there were lots of things you would expect to see in a city, like tall buildings and, residential and commercial areas. But overall, Naha was just kind of boring. It's like the city was a city, even if it was small, but there was just not much going on. And in fact, if you lived in China, but not in Naha, there was a very good chance you didn't know Naha even existed, like it was kind of irrelevant. However, in the last few months leading up to this moment that Sue is sitting at this train station, the city of Naha had suddenly been put on the map, and everybody knew about this city, because women from Naha were going missing in droves. In fact, Sue herself knew of at least a dozen women who had gone missing over the past few months from Naha. And as these women started going missing, it was making the news all over the country, and women who lived in Naha were acutely aware of the risks of being out alone, in fear that somebody was going to come snatch them up and take them away. In fact, every time Sue would go to work, she would make sure she would walk with other women, like in pairs, to ensure safety. This was a really scary time if you were a woman living in Naha. However, the caveat to the missing women was all of them to this point, when Sue was sitting at the train station, had been sex workers. And Sue, she thought, in virtue of not being a sex worker and instead being a kindergarten teacher, that somehow she was not actually that vulnerable to being snatched up or, whatever was happening to these women, she just felt like it wouldn't happen to her. But now, as Sue sat at this train station, which again was eerily quiet and vacant, she couldn't help but feel like she had made a bad decision being here. She felt like she could easily become the next woman who went missing from Naha. And so Sue began to think, maybe I should just go back home and try to patch things up with my husband, mostly for her safety, just to go back inside her home and be safe again. But before she could stand up to do that, she noticed on the other end of the platform this man who was exceptionally well dressed with this beautiful brown wool coat and fancy pants. He looked like he stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. He came up onto the train platform, and without saying a word, he walked slowly down the platform all the way to where Sue was, and he reached into his pocket and he held out a tissue to her because he saw she was crying. And Sue, she's looking up at the sky, and again, there's nobody else here, and she's very much on edge. And she doesn't know what to do. It was already creepy that this place was vacant, but it's even stranger to have a random man come up to her and try to initiate some sort of interaction with her. It just felt wrong and weird and very suspicious. But as Sue stared at the sky, trying to figure out what his angle was, she could see that he had kind of kept himself standing back from her, kind of a respectful distance, not trying to crowd her out. And he was looking at her with a very sympathetic look on his face, and he's holding this tissue out, and he said to her, "Are you okay?" And he hands the tissue again, like, "Please take it." And there was just something about this guy that felt very sincere, and Sue kind of let her guard down, and she accepted the tissue and wiped the tears from her eyes. She didn't say anything, and then this guy, he said, "Hey, do you mind if I sit with you?" And at this point, Sue said, "Yeah, okay, you can sit down." And so this very handsome, well-dressed man took a seat next to Sue, not right next to her, again, respectful distance from her. And again, he asked her, "Hey, are you doing okay?" And for Sue, whose life had been basically miserable the last few months or even years with this terrible marriage she was in, she wasn't used to being asked if she was okay. And this man, who she didn't know, had caught her at this very vulnerable moment in her life. And it was like all her emotions just came pouring out. And she began sobbing hysterically, telling this guy that no, she was not okay. Her life was in ruins. She had just abandoned her family and she had no idea what she was going to do. And finally, when Sue stopped telling this guy all about her problems, she felt very embarrassed and kind of looked up at him like she was sorry for even saying as much. But the man, who was very intently listening, he was just nodding along, very sympathetic, and he told Sue that his name was Gia Wang, and that he was a director at a factory not far from here, and if she was open to it, he'd be happy to think about hiring her at the factory, give her a new start potentially, because it seemed like that's what she really needed. And then he asked her if she wanted to come back to his house to discuss this job opportunity further. Now with this, even though Sue had really appreciated everything this guy had done to this point, the second he asked her to come back to his house, she's like, red flags are going up. She knew there's something off here. Clearly this guy does have an angle, and it's not to benefit me. And so she looked at him with an absolutely suspicious look, like, no way am I going to your house. I don't know you. Like, I appreciate the tissue and you letting me cry, but there's no way. But again, as she's staring at him with the suspicious look, the look on Gia's face remained very sympathetic and very gentle, and it almost seemed like he was just going to get up and go, like, hey, I'm sorry for offending you. But before he did get up to leave, Sue said, hold on. Actually, yes, I'll come with you. She didn't know why she agreed to go with him. Maybe it was because her life was so messed up at this point that she was just kind of ready to take chances and be sort of reckless, and this was definitely that. Big chance, very reckless. But again, she just felt like, there's something sincere about this guy, and she felt like she could trust him. And so Sue and Gia stood up, and together they walked down the train platform, not saying much. They went downstairs, they went out to the street, and they walked a couple of blocks to where Gia's street was. And as soon as they turned the corner and he showed Sue which house was his, Sue looked up, and whatever hesitations she had had still to that point about following the stranger to his house were gone, because she saw his house was beautiful. It wasn't that it was so grand or anything, it totally fit with the neighborhood, but it was very well maintained and totally felt on brand for a guy who was so well dressed and so well manicured and frankly so handsome. So Gia led the way to the front door of his house. He unlocked the door, he opened it up, and then he gently gestured for Sue to come on inside. And so she did. She walked past him, Gia followed her in, and the two of them took off their shoes and made their way into the kitchen, where Gia brewed some tea for them, and then they both sat down and began to sip their tea and talk about this job opportunity. And so for a few minutes, Gia is telling Sue all about the role and what she might be doing. And Sue is kind of asking general questions about it. But, for the most part, she just kind of enjoyed being in the presence of somebody who seemed to care about her. But after she finished her entire glass of tea, suddenly Gia, who had been talking this whole time about the factory, just stopped. It was like he was waiting for her to drink that entire drink. And as soon as she was done with her cup, Gia, again, he went quiet and just stared at Sue with this kind of sinister look on his face, like he was very pleased with what was going on. And at that point, Sue looked down at her teacup and then back at Gia, and suddenly she began to feel very drowsy. It was like her vision was beginning to go, and she realized Gia clearly had poisoned her. There was something inside of her tea. And so before she could do anything, everything went black. A couple of weeks later, just a few blocks away from where Sue met Gia at the train station, a police officer named Zhang was standing behind his desk at the police station when a very concerned-looking elderly couple came inside. Now, this couple was here to speak with Zhang about a missing person, but the missing person was not Sue. She had been missing for 2 weeks now, nobody had seen her, but no one had reported her missing. Her husband had just assumed that Sue had left him, and that's why he hadn't seen her, and so he had naturally not reported that. And again, nobody else knew she was missing, so keep that in mind. Officer Zhang has no idea about Sue and Gia, none of it. But when this elderly couple came in to make a missing person report, Officer Zhang was not the least bit surprised. It was now December of 1990, and over the past 6 months, 20 women out of Naha had suddenly gone missing. Remember, Sue is not one of those 20. The 20 are mostly sex workers who went missing at that same train station where Sue met Gia. And so Officer Zhang was used to making all these missing person reports. But candidly, the police actually felt like, because these were sex workers that were going missing, they weren't sure if they were actually being abducted or if they were simply getting on a train and kind of leaving town to go work somewhere else. And so really there wasn't a whole lot of investigation happening to figure out why so many of these women were going missing. But again, Officer Zhang, he's not surprised that they're telling him they want to file a missing person report. But when Zhang took this elderly couple to an interview room to talk to them about whoever was missing in their lives, when this couple spoke, Officer Zhang knew this was different, because the couple was not reporting another missing woman from Naha who also happened to be a sex worker. Instead, they were reporting that a man was missing, a businessman. However, the details of his disappearance sounded eerily similar to all these sex working women who had also gone missing. This guy was last seen at that same train station where Sue had met Gia, and then nobody had seen him, and so that's why they were here. And so Officer Zhang, he wrote up their report, and then he told the couple that, very likely this man is okay, and he'll show up at some point under his own steam, but he told them the police would look into it, and they'd be in touch. However, as this couple got up and turned around and left, Officer Zhang couldn't help but feel like this missing man and all these missing women went missing from the same place. And it's the same city and it's the same pattern over and over again, but now we have a man. And even though Zhang wanted to write it off as an anomaly, he started to wonder if this missing man was connected to all these missing women. Because by January of 1991, so 2 months after Sue had gone missing without a trace and still had not been reported by anybody, and 6 weeks after that elderly couple reported that man missing, another 5 people from Naha had gone missing, 2 more women and 3 more men. And so now the police in Naha were looking at 26 people, men and women, that had all gone missing very recently out of Naha, and nobody had a clue what happened to them. And importantly, because now there were men who were not sex workers who were going missing, the police couldn't just write this whole thing off as, oh, these sex working women are just going to another city to go do their work there. Like that was not a possibility anymore. Clearly something bad was happening, and the police knew they really needed to do a real investigation here. So finally, in early spring of that year, the police in Naha formed a task unit and legitimately began investigating all these disappearances. But amazingly, there was no information. There was nothing. These people went missing and nobody heard from them. There was no evidence of where they went. There was not even any sign that anything bad happened to them because no bodies had been found. There was no evidence of really anything happening. All the police knew is these 26 people, not including Sue, so she would be the 27th person, had been at this train station and then vanished. And that's all they knew. And it got to the point where this story really began to spread around China, and it became like this running joke that if you don't want to live, go to Naha, because everybody assumed there had to be some sort of serial killer or something happening there who was just roaming the streets, picking people off. By late summer of 1991, when really this story had taken hold across the country and was becoming a bigger and bigger deal because there was absolutely no resolution here, police had no idea what was going on, well, the whole situation got a whole lot worse because now, in addition to people suddenly vanishing at the train station in Naha, more people were also going missing in other cities nearby Naha, but all along the same train line that left out of Naha. So more train stations, more disappearances, all around the area, not just the city of Naha, but all around. And by the fall of that year, when over 30 people had gone missing all the same way from these train stations all around Naha, the police still had absolutely nothing to go on. All they had is, here are these people, here's where they were, they vanished, we got nothing else, no bodies, no evidence, nothing. But all that would change on October 22nd, 1991, roughly a year after Sue met Gia at the train station in Naha and then drank that drugged tea. On that October day in 1991, so again, a year after the disappearance of Sue, police at this train station, 1,700 miles away from the city of Naha, were doing random stops of commuters on the train platform. This had nothing to do with the ongoing investigation into all these missing people. This was just like public safety stuff, where the police were kind of just walking around, looking for people who looked suspicious, and then checking in on them to make sure they weren't doing anything illegal. And on this particular day, at this train station far away from Naha, one of these officers spotted this very handsome guy in a beautiful brown wool coat and very fancy pants and shoes, and he stood out a lot because of, frankly, how beautiful he was. And so the police officer saw him, and this very handsome guy looked up, and he saw the police officer, and it was like immediately he did something very suspicious. He reached down, grabbed a bag, and quickly turned around and began walking away. And at the same time, 2 other people who were right near this very handsome guy did the same thing. They grabbed bags off the ground, quickly turned around, fell in line with this handsome guy, and began quickly walking away from the police. And so the police obviously are totally suspicious. They run across the platform and they manage to stop all 3 of them, and they turn them around and they say, "Show me your bags, open them up." And the police, they would open up these bags and they contain drugs. And so right away, these 3 know they are caught, but they don't say anything. They just stand there and they're totally silent as the police are asking them, like, what are these drugs? Where are you going with these? What's going on here? They're not talking. And so finally the police go, "Give me your IDs right now." And so all three of them cough up their IDs, and the very handsome guy with the beautiful brown wool coat and fancy clothes, well, that was Jia Wang. The same Jia Wang who had gone with Sue into his house and given her the drugged tea. But again, these police officers are only concerned about the drugs. They don't know anything about these guys. They don't know that Jia met Sue and did this thing at his house with the tea. That wasn't even reported to police. Nobody knew about it. But these police knew they had caught these three people with these bags of illegal drugs, so they brought them back to the station and began to question each of them. And when they spoke to Jia, Jia said nothing. However, when they spoke to the two other people that were with Jia, one of them began to crack. It was obvious they had more to tell about these drugs, and they were kind of holding back tears, like they were very upset. And one of the interrogators, sensing one of these people was prepared to confess to something, instead of really drilling down on them, he was very comforting, and he offered them a blanket and said, here, take this blanket, relax, it's okay. You can tell me what's on your mind, it's okay. And that just totally broke this person, and they said, these drugs are nothing. You need to see what's in Jia's house. That will put these drugs to the side. They won't matter. What's in his house is horrible. The next day, a phone rang in the police station in Naha, and Officer Zhang picked it up, and it was one of the officers who interviewed these three people with drugs and got this whole horrible confession about what was inside of this guy Jia's house, and he told Zhang all about it. And as Zhang is listening to this, his eyes went wide because he knew this had to be connected to all these people going missing. Like, this has to be it. And so as soon as he hung up the phone, Officer Zhang rounded up 20 other police officers and 10 forensic doctors to go search Jia's house. And when they got there, the house from the outside looked just as beautiful as when Sue had seen it for the first time and felt like her reservations about Jia had gone down because of how wonderful his house looked. But as soon as all those police officers and the forensic doctors stepped inside of Jia's house, he wasn't home, there was nobody there. When they went inside, they were instantly hit with this horrible, horrible smell inside the house. Even though things are neat and beautiful inside too, there was something bad inside this house. And the smell seemed to be coming from the basement. And so at some point, Officer Zhang and the other officers, they got to the door, they opened it up, and they looked down, and all they could see was just this dark room down there, and the smell was so strong. But they pulled their shirts up over their faces, and they went down the stairs, and when they got down there, they couldn't see anything. It's totally dark. But the smell at this point was so overpowering that a couple of the officers almost fainted. And so literally they had to leave the house fearing they were breathing in toxic chemicals or something, and they had to wear gas masks just to go back into the house and back down into the basement. And when they got back down there, now wearing their masks, it didn't seem like there was anything down there that could produce such an awful smell. Like there was just nothing down there. But eventually one of the officers moved to the middle of the basement, right in the middle, and they realized there was an opening. And they looked down into it and they couldn't believe what they saw. And at the same time, somebody upstairs made an equally horrifying discovery because they discovered a videotape, a VHS cassette that contained this horrible footage that effectively explained what was going on inside of that pit in the basement. But to understand that, we need to go back a year to when Sue met Jia at the train station. She went back to his house and drank the drugged tea and blacked out. After Sue drank that tea, she didn't die. Jia did not kill her. Instead, she woke up a few hours later being totally confused, and she was immediately hit by this horrible smell, but it was totally pitch black. She can't see anything, and she began feeling her hands around her, and she felt stone everywhere she touched, and eventually she realized she was in what felt like the bottom of a well. But it wasn't water she was standing in. She was standing in something that almost felt like jelly, and she began kind of touching it to figure out what it was. She could not tell, but she couldn't help but feel like the things around her were kind of moving, like they were alive. And then suddenly a lid that clearly sat atop of this pit began to slide over above her. And so suddenly light was coming down into this pit. And at first, Sue looked up and she didn't see anything, but then she looked down and realized what was all around her. It was people, dead people, and potentially even half alive people that were just stuffed into this big pit that were all kind of decaying or, slowly dying or whatever it was. And she's just standing amongst it all. And then she looks up and she sees it's Jia, the beautiful man who had brought her here. He's standing up there looking down at her with a smile on his face. And Sue immediately pleads with him to please spare me, don't kill me. And Jia, he looks down at her kind of inquisitively, and he says, if I lift you out of there, will you do anything I tell you to do? And Sue said, yes, I'll do anything. Just get me out of here, please. So Gia, he reached down, he grabbed Sue, and he pulled her up and out of this pit inside of his basement. A few days later, Sue was back at the train station where she had met Gia for the first time, but this time she was alone, and she walked up onto that train platform with no intention of riding a train. Instead, as soon as she got up there, she began looking around, and then she spotted a businessman who was sitting on a bench. And she walked over to him, and she sat down next to him, and we don't know exactly what she said, but we think what she said was something maybe sexually suggestive or, something along those lines, and she's holding his shoulders and touching his hand. She doesn't know this man, and this man is very caught off guard by this, but he's kind of going along with it. And before long, she takes this businessman's hand, they stand up, and they walk out of the train station down to the street, and they make their way a couple blocks over to Gia's house. And when they get there, Sue leads into the front door, she opens it up, she brings the man inside, the door shuts, they take their shoes off, and Sue leads this man into the kitchen where Gia is waiting with a wire between each hand. And as soon as this businessman walked into the kitchen, Gia pounced on him, wrapped the wire around his neck and held it until the man passed out. And then he released the wire. And then Gia and Sue took this man, they lifted him up, and they carried him down into the basement and laid him out on the floor. So he's not in the pit, he's just out in the middle of the basement floor. Then Gia stepped away, picked up a video camera, turned it on, and began to film. He was filming the man on the ground and also Sue. And Sue, she knew what to do. She was going to do anything she was told to do. So she climbed on top of this still very much alive businessman who's just been knocked unconscious, and she straddles him so she's looking down at his head. Then she picks up a knife and she holds it in front of her, and then she looks up at Gia, who at this point has zoomed the camera in. She can hear the sound, the mechanics inside of the camera as it's zooming in on what she's about to do. And then she raises the knife over her head and drives it into this man's chest. The video that Gia shot of Sue murdering this man was the video police found on the first floor of the house shortly after police had found this horrible pit in Gia's basement. It would turn out that Gia Wang was absolutely the serial killer who was responsible for all these people going missing from the train stations. He would abduct them just like he did Sue, and he would bring them to his house, and then he would do horrible, horrible things to them, and eventually he would chuck their bodies into this pit. And so when he abducted Sue, he actually thought that when he drugged her, that he had killed her, and he had chucked her into the pit, believing she was dead. But when Sue had woken up inside of that pit, when he opened it up and looked down and there she was, fully alive, he had an idea. Well, why don't I turn Sue into a murderer like me? She can help me. And so that was the condition for her being pulled out of this pit, that she would assist him in murdering people, and she agreed to do it. And so the reason the profile of victims changed from sex working women to random men is because those are the people that Sue went after. She began targeting men. And so when that elderly couple came in and reported to Officer Zhang that a man was missing, that was Sue's first victim, the man who had been seen on video being stabbed in the chest by Sue. Now, nobody to this day understands why Sue actually went along with this. Like, she was pulled up out of the pit, but then when she was told to go to the train station and find your first victim, it's unclear why she didn't just go to the police and say, hey, there's a serial killer, Gia, here's his house, here's where he is, go get him. For some reason, she just did what he said. And in fact, Sue was not the only person who was brought into this murdering scheme. He managed to convince 3 other people, including his ex-wife, to also commit murders for him. And all 3 of those people also had ample opportunity to flee and tell police, but they didn't. All of these people just did what Gia wanted without asking any questions. It was like he had absolute control over these people. That is, until that day in October of 1991, when those police officers doing a public safety check spotted Gia along with 2 accomplices fleeing with drugs, and they stopped them and they got them back to the station, and one of his accomplices finally broke and told the truth. And the person who told the truth, the accomplice who broke, was Sue. She was there with him at the train station, nobody knew she was missing, and she was the one who, when offered a blanket and was told, tell us the truth, she came clean. Ultimately, it was this police officer's kindness that broke her. In Gia's basement, inside of that horrible pit, right in the middle of it, were 42 bodies, 24 women and 18 men. In the end, Gia and all 4 of his forced accomplices, including Sue, were sentenced to death, and they were executed on January 24th, 1992. Today, the city of Naha is still just as infamous as it was in the 90s when these murders took place. And in fact, the nickname for Naha is now just Bandit City to reflect what happened there. Josie Baker smiled as she watched her 4-year-old daughter, Lila, hunt for frogs near the stream behind their house. Josie's other daughter, 1-year-old Adelaide, gripped her mother's hand as she wobbled forward to see what her big sister was up to. On this sunny afternoon in late March of 2021, the 24-year-old mother felt like her dreams were actually coming true. Just over a year ago, Josie had moved into this small house in the farmlands north of Dallas, Texas, with her family. They all loved the fresh air and wide open space, and little Lila had become close friends with the cows that grazed in the pasture next door. Josie shared her daughter's love of animals. She actually worked as a veterinary assistant in a local animal hospital, and the family had even taken in a pet raccoon named Jinx. Josie checked her watch and realized her husband, Dustin, would be home soon from his job as a firefighter and paramedic, and so she needed to start fixing dinner. She called out to Lila and scooped up baby Adelaide. Then the whole crew headed for the back door of their house. But the moment Josie stepped inside the house, she was overwhelmed by a strong floral smell, like someone nearby was wearing way too much perfume. Josie held her nose and peeked inside the kitchen. And it was a total mess. Cabinet doors were wide open, and it looked like the food inside had been hurled across the room. Boxes of cereal and bags of chips were ripped open and spilled all over the counter and the floor. The cabinet under the kitchen sink was also open, and broken bottles of dishwashing detergent and other cleaning supplies were spread out all over the place. And when Josie looked closely, she saw something else. Tiny animal footprints tracking the mess out of the room. Now, Josie knew exactly what had happened to her kitchen. Jinx, their raccoon, had ransacked it. Jinx was supposed to live in an enclosure in the living room, but clearly he'd escaped and decided to have some fun in the kitchen. Josie ultimately found Jinx hiding under the bed in Lila's bedroom, and while she was mad, she couldn't really stay mad at him as he stared out at her with his little black cute eyes. And so Josie coaxed him out with some food before picking him up and returning him to his pen. As she swept up the broken glass in the kitchen, Josie felt like she actually had kind of dodged a bullet here. Because, this could have been a whole lot worse if maybe her girls had come into the house ahead of her and maybe got cut on all the shards of glass lying around. And so as she dumped the trash into a wastebasket, she had to admit to herself that all in all, the whole scene in front of her was actually kind of funny. While the house may be a total mess and a total pain to clean up, one thing was certain. Their little raccoon Jinx, after breaking into all the cleaning supplies, was now the sweetest smelling raccoon in the state of Texas. 2 weeks later, after tucking in the girls for the night, Josie walked back out to the living room to snuggle up on the couch with her husband Dustin. But when she stepped into the room, she found Dustin standing in the corner, staring into Jinx's enclosure. Josie was curious, and so she walked over to see what he was looking at, and when she looked down, she gasped. Jinx was acting so weird. The raccoon swayed and staggered as he walked around his enclosure, almost like he was drunk. He also kept bumping into objects and walls, which made Josie think maybe his vision was impaired. Because of her job as a veterinary technician, Josie had been around plenty of sick animals, but Jinx's condition was something she'd actually never seen before in any other animal. So she told Dustin that she would bring Jinx with her to the animal hospital first thing in the morning. The next morning, Josie stood by while one of the vets at her hospital examined her raccoon. But after a few minutes, the vet turned to Josie and admitted that they too were totally stumped by whatever was bothering Jinx. They didn't understand what it was. Josie agreed that the best course of action now would be to keep Jinx under observation at the hospital and run some additional tests. But over the course of his stay, nothing the veterinarians did seemed to help Jinx, and in fact, Jinx just seemed to get sicker and sicker until he basically just lay in his cage, panting with his tongue out. And then 2 days after he had come to the hospital, Jinx died. Josie was devastated, but she was far more concerned about how her daughter Lila would react to Jinx's passing. She was going to be absolutely heartbroken. The day after Jinx's death, the Baker family walked solemnly down the path behind their house towards the stream, and they buried Jinx under a tree. At the end of the service, Josie kneeled down and helped a very sad Lila plant flowers atop her beloved pet's final resting place. A few weeks later, on the afternoon of May 29th, Josie sat on her living room couch right next to Lila, who for the past couple of days had been vomiting and running a fever. Her pediatrician had said that it was probably just the stomach flu and recommended rest and fluids. So Josie had pulled together all these pillows and blankets and put them on the couch to let her daughter relax and watch TV while she recuperated. However, as Josie looked at her sleeping daughter beside her, she felt increasingly worried. Josie had been carefully following the doctor's instructions, but Lila's fever really hadn't broken yet, and she was still struggling to keep her food down. Lila had been sleeping for a couple of hours now, so Josie gently placed her hand on Lila's forehead and whispered to her to wake up so she could drink some water. But as Lila slowly opened her eyes, Josie could see that they looked glazed over and unfocused. Josie tried to help Lila sit up, but the little girl could barely lift her head. Josie immediately wrapped her daughter in a blanket and carried her to the car. Her barely conscious 4-year-old needed to see a doctor right away. Later that day, Josie climbed out of an ambulance outside of the Children's Hospital in Dallas, Texas, while orderlies ran to help unload Lila from the back. The doctor at their local hospital, where Josie had gone first, had told Josie that based on her daughter's condition, this local hospital could not help her. They needed specialized care. So Lila had been rushed in an ambulance to a major pediatric hospital instead. Once Lila was unloaded from the ambulance, she was immediately taken up to the intensive care unit. At the same time, a doctor named Catherine Merrill met with Josie in the hallway to explain what they were going to do to treat her daughter. Dr. Merrill said that Lila's white blood cell count was very high, which was a strong indicator that Lila was fighting off an infection. Josie listened carefully as the doctor laid out the range of tests they planned to run to try to figure out where this infection came from and where it was located in Lila's body. Dr. Merrill also explained that while the testing was in progress, they would also be administering antibiotics to Lila to help her fight off whatever this infection was. As they talked, Josie could hear her daughter throwing up again, so Josie quickly thanked the doctor and rushed back to her daughter's bedside. Over the next couple of days, the doctors and nurses and medical team ran dozens of tests on Lila, but unfortunately, the results of those tests didn't really tell them anything. All the tests could confirm was that whatever was going on with Lila was not one of the common suspects, like bacterial meningitis or a foodborne disease like salmonella. And as each test came back basically showing nothing, Dr. Merrill became more and more confused. Meanwhile, Lila's condition grew even worse. Her frequent vomiting caused her to have trouble breathing, which led to low oxygen levels in her blood. So Dr. Merrill decided to insert a breathing tube through Lila's nose and down her windpipe, requiring the little girl to be heavily sedated. Lila's illness consumed the entire family, as first Josie and then Dustin took leave from their jobs so they could spend more time at the hospital with their girl. But day after day, no new information came in, and Lila kept getting worse. Not only was she completely incapable of holding her head up now, she couldn't even walk or speak. And so it wasn't long before Josie and Dustin began to fear the worst, that they might never get their sweet, energetic 4-year-old back. One night in June, nearly 2 weeks after Lila got sick, Dr. Merrill entered Lila's hospital room and found her parents at her bedside as usual. After giving Lila an extensive examination, Dr. Merrill thought that this infection was actually attacking Lila's brain and nervous system. In order to find out for sure, Lila's doctors would perform a brain biopsy, which meant they would cut a small opening in Lila's skull to acquire tiny samples of her brain tissue. Josie thought that sounded like a very intense operation for such a young girl in such a weakened state already, but the brain biopsy was also their best remaining hope to find out what was going on with her. So Josie and Dustin looked at each other for a moment, and it was clear they both understood they didn't really have a choice here. They had to do this, so they told Dr. Merrill to go ahead with the procedure. A few days later, Josie sat by Lila's hospital bed and read to her from her favorite book, while Dustin napped nearby in a chair. Lila was still not able to speak or walk, but she had made it through the brain biopsy just fine and was actually starting to show small signs of improvement. And so Josie was actually feeling optimistic for the first time in a while.
But moments later, Dr. Merrill entered and pulled up a chair to speak with the parents. The results had come back from the brain biopsy, and there was finally an answer to what was ailing their daughter. But the answer was not a good one. Dr. Merrill said that Lila was suffering from a rare and potentially deadly bacterial infection known as melioidosis. The doctor explained that once this bacteria invades a person's system, it causes pus-filled abscesses in whatever tissue it reaches, which is why nearly 40% of melioidosis patients die. And in Lila's case, the bacteria had entered her brain and nervous system, which was why she was having so much trouble moving and speaking, and seemed very disoriented. All of this was obviously totally devastating to Josie and Dustin, but the doctor told the very upset parents that there actually was reason for hope. Now that they actually knew which bacteria was making their daughter sick, they could give her the right antibiotics to help Lila try to defeat the infection once and for all. 2 weeks after Lila's brain biopsy, a woman in her 20s named Julia Petrus arrived at the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, in Atlanta, Georgia, for her first day as an epidemic intelligence officer. For years, Julia had worked as a nurse, providing health services to refugees in Bangladesh and Uganda. More recently, she provided medical care for homeless people in Santa Barbara, California, in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. And now she was excited to take on a new challenge. As an epidemic intelligence officer, Julia was now basically a disease detective who would investigate mysterious outbreaks and do her best to prevent the spread of infections. As Julia sat down at her desk and checked her email inbox for the first time, she could see that she was already invited to a Zoom meeting that was starting in just a few minutes. CDC officials would be briefing the FBI about a recent outbreak of melioidosis, a very rare bacterial infection. Julia was familiar with melioidosis, but she didn't understand why this disease would involve the FBI, an agency that investigates crimes. But regardless, moments later, Julia clicked the link on her calendar and logged into the Zoom meeting. After a quick round of introductions, a CDC official began the briefing with a discussion of the case of 4-year-old Lila Baker, who was still in the Dallas Children's Hospital suffering from melioidosis. Julia also learned from this meeting that 2 other cases of melioidosis had been reported in the US in the last 4 months. There was a woman in Kansas who died 9 days after being admitted to the hospital, and a man in Minnesota who was still fighting his symptoms. But there was something strange about all 3 of these cases. Melioidosis was caused by a bacteria that, for all intents and purposes, did not exist in the United States. The bacteria was mostly found in Southeast Asia and Northern Australia. Usually, the only way a person in the United States got melioidosis was by traveling to a region of the world where the bacteria was present. But none of these 3 patients had traveled outside the United States anytime recently. Julia could understand why the CDC wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery. It obviously was in their purview, but she still wasn't sure why the FBI was on this call with them. And it was at this point that one of her colleagues reminded the other attendees on the meeting that this bacteria was so toxic that it was classified as a Tier 1 select agent, and the federal government viewed it as a potential weapon if it got into the wrong hands. And so at this point, the official said the CDC could not rule out the possibility that this melioidosis bacteria had been released into the United States intentionally. Meaning this could potentially be an act of bioterrorism, which is why the FBI was now being briefed up on the situation. Julia was absolutely shocked at this revelation. This was quite an assignment for her first day on the job, and it wasn't even lunchtime. Before her wild first day at the CDC was over, Julia had ordered DNA analysis from the bacteria that was collected from the 3 patients. And within days, the results confirmed exactly what the CDC had feared. The 3 samples were genetically identical, meaning they had all come from the same place. And further investigation revealed to Julia and her colleagues that this particular strain of bacteria could be traced to southern Asia. Julia's next question was, how did the bacteria move all the way from Asia to 3 separate households in the United States? Had it come here on an infected plant or animal, in soil, or a commercial product? Or could it actually have been spread by a bioterrorist who just wanted to hurt people? There were literally thousands of possibilities, and Julia knew that the only way to narrow them down was to find out what the 3 victim households had in common. So she picked up the phone and started calling all the families of the victims. She needed to let them know that the CDC was going to go to their homes and search them. A few days later, Julia drove through the wide-open farmlands of northern Texas on her way to the home of the Baker family. The day before, she had spoken with Josie and Dustin Baker about the need for her to come and collect samples from their property. Other CDC officers were going to scour the homes of the patients from Kansas and Minnesota with the same goal: finding melioidosis bacteria. As Julia pulled her car into the gravel driveway in front of the Baker's home, a woman came out and introduced herself as Josie's sister. She said that Josie and Dustin were still at the hospital with Lila, but she was here now to let Julia know that she had free rein to collect whatever material she thought was relevant to her investigation. Julia thanked her, then started searching every inch of the Baker property for anything that looked like it could have come from Asia. She collected samples of food and cleaning products and placed them in plastic bags. Then she scraped algae from an empty aquarium she found behind the house, since there had been cases where imported tropical fish carried the deadly bacteria. Finally, Julia took soil samples from the bank of the stream near the house, as well as from the plants. As Julia waved to the sister and drove away from the Baker's home, she felt she had been very thorough in her investigation. Although she was still new to this job, she felt like it was very possible to her that the bacteria they were looking for was hidden inside one of the bags and bottles in the trunk of her car right now. A couple of weeks later, in late July, Julia sat in a conference room with the other CDC investigators on her team. Julia scrolled through the pages of laboratory results on her laptop, but she admitted to her colleagues that she was totally stumped. Investigators had gathered hundreds of samples from the 3 locations where people got sick, but none of them contained any trace of the bacteria. But before Julia could start to discuss next steps, one of her colleagues cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. Then he read out loud from an email that had just come in on his phone. And as he read, Julia grew even more troubled. The CDC had just gotten word of a 4th case of melioidosis. This one was in Georgia. The patient was a 5-year-old boy who, like the other 3 patients, had never traveled to any region of the world where this bacteria was present. DNA analysis showed that the bacteria that infected him was identical to the samples from the other 3 patients. So he'd most likely gotten it from the same source as all the other patients. Julia closed her eyes as she thought about this new information. The news from Georgia was obviously distressing, but the fact that only one new case had emerged over the course of the last month was probably good news. If terrorists were trying to use the bacteria as a weapon, wouldn't there be many more victims by now? Julia was beginning to think that this outbreak couldn't be an act of bioterrorism. But if this outbreak wasn't bioterrorism, then what was it? Something was causing people to get sick all across the country, and the CDC had no idea what it was. As Julia walked back to her office, lost in thought, she suddenly felt resolved. Their investigation had indeed been thorough and comprehensive, but clearly they had to do more. A few weeks later, on a warm evening in the middle of August 2021, Josie Baker stood by Lila as her daughter's wheelchair was lowered from a van to the ground outside their home. Friends and family were gathered by the front door, clapping and cheering. After 2.5 months in the hospital, Lila was finally home. Josie was overwhelmed with emotion as she carefully pushed her daughter up a ramp that had been installed outside their house just a week prior. Lila's physical condition had stabilized and she was now breathing on her own. But as Josie watched Dustin lift Lila out of her wheelchair and gently lay her on her bed, Josie also knew that there was a long and challenging road ahead of them. Lila had still not regained her ability to speak or walk. Even holding her head upright continued to be a challenge. Josie had to accept a painful truth. There was a good possibility that her daughter had suffered permanent damage to her nervous system. And Josie had another worry. She still had no idea how or where Lila had picked up the bacteria. CDC investigators had not found the bacteria on their property, but it still seemed possible to Josie that it could still be lurking somewhere in their house. So she couldn't shake the idea that if they continued to live in this house, at some point somebody else in the family was going to get this disease as well. Later that same month, in one of the conference rooms for the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Julia picked up a dry erase pen and started drawing on a whiteboard. Julia had been on the case for almost 2 months, and the agency still had no clue how the 4 patients had contracted this bacteria. Julia knew time was running out to solve this puzzle. The more time passed, the greater the chance that the source of the bacteria might be spread to other locations. So Julia thought, maybe if she just wrote down everything they knew on this whiteboard, that maybe somehow it would help her connect all the dots. Julia's colleagues watched as she divided the board into 4 columns, one for each of the patients. Under each column, Julia listed key details, including dates, medical symptoms, and environmental factors that could be relevant. As the board began to fill up, the team searched for any common factors that could help narrow their search for the source of the bacteria. At some point, Julia had written a ton on this board and just stepped back and looked at it. And when she did, she saw it. 3 of the 4 patients showed signs that the infection had entered their brains, including the patients in Texas, Georgia, and Minnesota. Julia realized that this common thread could be an important clue as to how the bacteria entered the bodies of these patients. If their brains were infected, the bacteria most likely entered their body through their noses rather than through a cut or something they ate or drank, because the quickest route to the brain was through the nasal cavity, meaning there was a very good chance that in all of these cases, the bacteria was somehow inhaled. Julia felt re-energized. Even though CDC investigators had now made multiple trips to the victims' homes to collect samples, Julia knew, now that they had this information about inhaling the bacteria, that they would have to visit all of them one more time. Minutes later, Julia left and headed back to her apartment and began to pack her suitcase. Over the weeks that followed, Julia and her colleagues returned to the homes of all 4 patients and retrieved more samples for testing. They collected anything and everything they could find that could possibly be inhaled, regardless of whether it could have come from Asia. Julia and her colleagues knew they were ultimately searching for a needle in a haystack, but they had to try. And so by September, Julia and the rest of the CDC team had sent hundreds of additional specimens to their laboratory for analysis. And finally, in October of 2021, Julia received a call from a microbiologist who was assigned to this case. The search was finally over. A sample retrieved from the Georgia site contained traces of the melioidosis bacteria. And so after hearing this, it didn't take long for Julia and her team to figure out how the bacteria actually made the trip from Asia to America, causing 4 Americans to be attacked by a bacteria so toxic that the government considered it a potential bioweapon. But in the case of 4-year-old Lila Baker, the spread of the bacteria actually got an assist from a very unusual accomplice. Seven months earlier, in March of 2021, while Josie was watching Lila hunt for frogs near the stream behind their house, the family's beloved pet raccoon, Jinx, was busy ransacking their kitchen. Jinx was on a hunt for food, and he had made a huge mess as he opened every cabinet and drawer, ripping open boxes and bags in search of a tasty snack. Jinx eventually climbed onto the counter near the sink, and he saw a small bottle of liquid. The raccoon soon knocked the bottle off the counter, causing it to break open and spill onto the kitchen floor, releasing that very strong floral aroma into the kitchen. And then when Josie and the kids entered the house, Jinx made a run for it, hopping into that puddle and tracking that floral-smelling liquid throughout the house as he ran away to hide. The bottle that Jinx knocked off the shelf was a United States branded product that Josie bought at Walmart a few weeks earlier. And that same product had been purchased by all 4 of the households that had been struck by melioidosis. What Josie and the other families did not realize is that while they had all bought this American product at a local American store, it It was actually manufactured and bottled at a factory near the southern tip of India. The bacteria that causes melioidosis was known to thrive in the wetter environments of this particular region of India. And somehow, in the process of manufacturing thousands of bottles of this air freshener, known as Better Homes and Gardens Lavender and Chamomile Essential Oil Infused Aromatherapy Room Spray, the bacteria got into the liquid inside. The bottles were then shipped to Walmart stores all across the United States. When customers used the product inside their home, particles of the melioidosis bacteria were sprayed into the air, where they were all inhaled by the people who lived there. Now, most of the people who inhaled the bacteria were healthy enough to fight off the bacteria, and they did not get seriously ill, but the victims in Kansas and Minnesota had other conditions that made them more vulnerable to this infection. And Lila and the young boy in Georgia were just so young that their immature immune systems were unable to fight off the bacteria before serious damage was done to their bodies. As soon as the source of this bacteria was identified, the CDC alerted Walmart, and Walmart quickly discontinued sale of the product and withdrew it from the market. Consumers who purchased the spray were told not to throw it away or pour it down the drain, since that could increase the risk of spreading the bacteria. Instead, they were directed to put the bottle inside of 2 Ziploc bags, then place it inside of a cardboard box, and then physically return it to a Walmart store. But that was not quite the end of this story. CDC investigator Julia Petrus eventually learned of a 5th potential victim of this strain of the melioidosis bacteria. Jinx, the Baker family's beloved pet raccoon, who died shortly after breaking the bottle that contained the contaminated air freshener. Julia hated the idea of disturbing Jinx's grave in the Baker's backyard, but there was a chance that the melioidosis bacteria had actually spread into the environment after he was buried. And so, on April 19, 2022, Julia and other CDC officials returned to the Baker's home in Texas and dug up Jinx's body. But after doing some analysis, Julia and the Baker family were relieved to discover that although Jinx had died of melioidosis, no additional bacteria was detected in the soil or vegetation surrounding Jinx's grave. As of late 2023, Lila Baker has not regained her ability to speak or walk. Josie quit her job at the animal hospital and devoted herself full-time to the care of her daughter. Sadly, the little boy in Georgia died from the infection. However, the other 2 human patients did make full recoveries.
On August 9th, 1989, 23-year-old Duncan McPherson pulled his little red car into a parking lot inside of a lush green valley in Vienna, Austria. After parking his car, Duncan reached across his middle console and he grabbed an apple out of a bag, and then he took a bite and just admired the unbelievable landscape all around him. He was near the Austrian Alps, and so there were literally just mountains jutting up everywhere. Duncan, who was originally from Canada, had been this highly touted, unbelievable first-round draft pick by the New York Islanders back in 1984. The Islanders are a professional ice hockey team in the United States. But despite Duncan's incredible promise and athleticism, he just couldn't ever get it together, and so he never actually made the New York Islanders' big league roster. And so, in 1989, Duncan started to realize that maybe his hockey career was coming to an end. But instead of just hanging up his skates in frustration, Duncan decided he would pursue a different type of career that kept him still within the hockey world. He would become a coach. And so, in 1989, Duncan had agreed to coach this small-time professional hockey team in Scotland. And for Duncan, his thought was, I'll go there, I'll learn how to be a good coach, and then down the road, I'll maybe have the opportunity to coach much more prominent and prestigious teams. But before moving to Scotland and beginning this new career, Duncan decided what he really needed right now was just to take a break. Because for basically his whole life, Duncan had been playing hockey around the clock practically 7 days a week. You don't get to become a first-round draft pick unless hockey is your life. And so Duncan thought, before I begin this huge life transition, I'm gonna just kick back and relax and go on a huge European vacation. And one of the first stops of this vacation was going to be the Austrian Alps right in front of him. However, he wasn't just going to look at these incredible mountains, he was going to snowboard down them. Or more specifically, he was going to learn how to snowboard on these incredible mountains. And so Duncan finished eating his apple and then chucked the core into the bag. And then he hopped out of his car, shut the door, locked it, and then began walking across the parking lot towards the white gondola station. A gondola is like a ski lift, but much bigger. It's kind of like a small bus with lots of windows, and it's connected to a cable, and that cable, which is elevated off the ground, pulls you up and down mountains. Now, typically, people ride gondolas just for the incredible view of the mountain from up high. But some gondolas are actually in place to take people to specific locations in the mountain. And typically these locations are areas that are not accessible otherwise. You need a gondola to get there. And in Duncan's case, the gondola that he was about to hitch a ride on was of the latter variety. It carried passengers from the station near this parking lot high up into the Austrian Alps, up to about 10,000 feet of elevation, where there was another gondola station called the Eisgrot Mountain Station. And right next to the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station was a very unique ski resort called the Stubai Glacier. And overwhelmingly, this ski resort was the reason why people were taking this gondola. This ski resort was unique not only because it was very hard to get to, you basically had to take a gondola or hike up to it, but also because the actual slope that skiers and snowboarders would use at this resort was not just a snowy mountainside like virtually all other ski resorts around the world are. No, instead, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort was a glacier, and so people were literally skiing and snowboarding on a glacier, hence the name. And a glacier, in simple terms, is just a huge swath of thick, permanently frozen ice. And so, in the warmer months, when other ski resorts around the world were not able to continue operations because there was no snow, or it was too warm to make snow, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort did not have that problem. Because, in those warmer months, they could just drive their huge snowcat tractors with their big rakes behind them all over the slope, the glacier, and their rakes would basically chop up the top layer of the ice, turning it into powder for people to ski on, which allowed them to basically stay open every day of the year. And so Duncan, back down in the parking lot, he walked over to the gondola station, he bought his gondola ticket, and then he hitched a ride on the first gondola that swung through the station. And after a slow but beautiful ride up into the mountains, where all that lush greenery down below in the valley was replaced by jagged snow and ice up in the Alps, Duncan finally saw the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort and the glacier itself right behind it that stretched up to the top of the mountain. A few minutes later, the gondola Duncan was on arrived at the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station, and Duncan, along with the others inside of the gondola, hopped off. And then Duncan immediately walked over to the resort and headed into the equipment rental store. And after getting his snowboard and his boots and all the other equipment he would need, he headed right back outside to wait for his instructor to arrive. Duncan had previously purchased a lesson with an instructor at the resort. It was set for 11 a.m. And so Duncan, he's out there at the foot of this glacier, and right at 11, an instructor walks over and introduces himself, and Duncan and the instructor immediately start getting into the basics of snowboarding, how to put your boots into your bindings, how to use the edges of your board. And then for a little while, the instructor and Duncan didn't go up the glacier. Instead, they just kind of worked on some basics on the flat ground right there. And then after the instructor felt like Duncan was ready to go, they both walked over to the tow rope, which is a way to get to the top of the slope. There's a cable that kind of rotates from the top to the bottom of the mountain, and there are all these bars attached to the cable, and skiers and snowboarders grab the bar while standing on their snowboard or their skis, and they literally get pulled up the mountain. And so Duncan and the instructor grabbed onto the tow rope, they made their way to the top of the glacier, and from there they pushed over to the start of the run. And once they were there, the instructor strapped into his snowboard, and then Duncan strapped into his, and then they were off, very slowly making their way kind of like a falling leaf pattern. Duncan was not just going straight down the mountain, he's a beginner, and so it's very slow, very controlled, and as they went down, the instructor's giving Duncan tips, how to stay more on his edge, how to slow down, how to speed up. And very quickly, the instructor saw that Duncan was so good at balancing, his legs were so strong, likely because he was a professional hockey player. And so the instructor was telling Duncan the whole time they're going down how unbelievably good he was doing for his first lesson. And so finally, after about an hour of very slowly making their way all the way down this glacier, they reached the bottom where they had first been doing some flat ground stuff. And when they got there, it had started to rain. And it was raining bad enough that lots of people on the mountain were abandoning the mountain and running inside of the resort to get out from under the rain. And so the instructor, he looked at his watch and he realized they were almost at 1 p.m., which was the end of their lesson. And he said to Duncan, I don't think we have time to go back up. Plus it's raining. Duncan said he didn't care about the rain, but he also understood that, it wasn't ideal conditions. And so they decided that even though there was a few minutes left, they would just cancel the lesson right there, and they would actually just go inside and grab lunch together. And so they made their way out of the rain into the resort, and when they went inside the resort, the instructor noticed that Duncan's sweater, which was underneath his yellow rain jacket, was totally soaked. And so he offered to Duncan, hey, do you want to take your sweater off and I'll hang it up inside my office? And, by the end of the day, it should be dry. And Duncan thought, great, that's fine. So he took off his wet sweater, he gave it to the instructor, and while the instructor was going to his office, Duncan went into the gift shop and he just bought a new sweater for the day. And after that, Duncan had his new sweater on with his rain jacket over it, and then he met the instructor in the cafeteria, where they both sat down and had a nice meal. They got to know each other a little bit better. After they were done eating, both of them looked out the window and saw the rain had subsided, but in its place was lots of fog that was rolling in, and so very few people were going back onto the mountain. But the instructor told Duncan that, hey, you did so good today that you should really go back out there on your own this afternoon and practice. Do some runs, go nice and slow, same as I was teaching you. And then tomorrow, when we have our follow-up lesson, we can maybe, get into some more advanced things. Duncan thought that was a great idea. He said he would definitely go out there and practice on his own. And then the two men cleaned up, and the instructor made his way to meet his next client, and Duncan headed right outside, grabbed his snowboard, and began walking towards the tow rope.
In the crowded streets we stand, I will always hold your hand. Not 'cause I fear we'll part, but to show you own my heart.
The next morning, Duncan's snowboard instructor arrived a little bit early to work. And so after getting off the gondola, he made his way over to the resort and he grabbed a cup of coffee in the same cafeteria where he and Duncan had eaten the day before. And then after finishing that coffee, the instructor grabbed his snowboard and the rest of his gear and then headed outside to meet Duncan in the meeting spot they had both agreed on. But when it was time for the lesson to start, Duncan didn't show up. And so the instructor for a second thought, was there somewhere else we were going to meet? Did I get the time wrong? But he checked the time and he remembered the conversation he had with Duncan. They were going to meet at the foot of the tow rope and he was right there and Duncan wasn't. And so he thought, okay, maybe Duncan's running late. But he waited and waited and waited, and Duncan never showed up. The instructor was bummed because he and Duncan really had kind of become friends the day before, and he was looking forward to teaching Duncan some more today. But the instructor knew it was pretty common for tourists to cancel their follow-up snowboard or ski lessons. It's like they show up for that first day, they get really into it, they plan on going the next day, but then other distractions in their vacation pull them elsewhere, and they no-show for the lesson. And so the instructor didn't take it personally. He just assumed that, Duncan had found something else to do that was more fun. But the instructor knew he would see Duncan again because Duncan's sweater was still sitting in the instructor's office. 1 week later, Duncan's parents, who were back home in Saskatoon, Canada, got a very unexpected phone call from the Dundee Tigers hockey team, which was the professional hockey team in Scotland that Duncan was going to go coach after this big European vacation. The team rep for this hockey team asked the parents if they knew where their son was because he had not shown up for his first day of work. And Duncan's parents, they immediately were like, that doesn't make any sense. He was so excited about this job. This is a really big deal for him. He would never miss the first day. And so the parents told the team rep that they would try to get in touch with Duncan, and as soon as they did, they'd be in touch with the team, and the team rep said they would do the exact same thing for the parents. However, after this call, the parents quickly realized that trying to get in touch with their son was going to be nearly impossible. They knew Duncan had gone on this big European vacation, but they didn't have his itinerary. They didn't know what countries he was going to, in what order. They really only knew that he was really excited and he was just going to be on vacation. That was kind of it. And remember, this is 1989. They can't just call Duncan. There weren't cell phones. They didn't have the easy modern ways that we all communicate instantly. And so the parents are like, who do we even call? Where do we go? What do we do? And so ultimately, even though this felt kind of dramatic at the time, the parents decided to file a missing person report with Interpol, which is an organization that connects police across international lines. However, the parents quickly learned that this missing person report was not going to become a high priority item for any police anywhere in Europe, because their son was 23, he's healthy, he's strong, he's smart, he's of sound mind, and really all that had happened was Duncan had missed a single day of work on the back end of a huge vacation. So there's lots of reasons why that could have happened. Maybe he extended his vacation. Yeah, it's not professional, but it's totally possible. Or maybe he doesn't want to take the job after all. Or maybe he's just running late. I mean, there's a lot of very logical explanations for why Duncan didn't show up. And so, in short, the parents were told that if you want to find your son right now and not just wait for him to reappear, well, you better go looking yourself. And without hesitation, that's exactly what Duncan's parents did. They packed up a couple of suitcases and they headed to Europe to go find their son. Because to them, it felt like something was wrong here and there was no time to waste. But again, the parents have no idea where their son would have gone in Europe. And so they don't really have a good starting point. They don't know who to talk to, but they just began chasing down every single seemingly insignificant lead they came across. And as they traveled all over Europe, they hung up thousands and thousands of flyers that showed their son's face, said he was missing, and here's a number to call if you know where he is. But despite these efforts, the parents really got nowhere. That is, until about a month into their search, when still they have not found Duncan, they have no idea where he is, they've chased down all these leads, they've all dead-ended, and at this time, the parents convinced several news outlets around Europe to air a segment on their news about Duncan. And one of those missing person segments aired in Austria, and the news anchor in Austria, when they were doing the segment, they described the car that Duncan was almost definitely driving when he went missing. It was that little red car. The parents had discovered in chasing down their leads that their son had borrowed the little red car from a childhood friend who used to play hockey with him, and the friend had told the parents that he had lent it to Duncan, and Duncan had told him he would have it for a week and then return it. But Duncan had never returned the car. And so the anchor in Austria does this segment about how Duncan is missing, and if you have information, come forward. They describe the little red car, and sure enough, not long after this segment aired in Austria, somebody found Duncan's car. It was still sitting in that parking lot right near the Stubai Glacier gondola. Immediately, when Duncan's parents heard about this, they flew to Vienna, Austria, and they met with police who brought them out to look at their son's car. They hadn't moved it. It was still just sitting where he had left it. And then also police showed the parents what they had found inside of the car, which included Duncan's passport, a letter to his girlfriend, where he talked about how excited he was to go to Scotland, and also a bag of rotten fruit. The police also told the parents that now, with the discovery of this vehicle, they were going to really lean into this missing person case to try to find their son, and that the next day they were going to launch this huge search of the area near where his car was to hopefully find Duncan. And so the parents, who were now cautiously optimistic that they might get some answers, they left the police and they went to a local hotel to rest up before the next day when they would be up early and join this huge search party. But when they got to that local hotel, they did what they always did everywhere they went in Europe. They began handing out all these missing person flyers with Duncan's face on them to everybody they saw in the lobby. They began hanging them up all over the hotel. And sure enough, just by completely random chance, they handed one of these flyers to Duncan's snowboard instructor. They handed it to him, he looked at it, and he did a double take, and he was like, I know him. And he explained how he taught Duncan how to snowboard, and then Duncan didn't show up the next day, and he just figured, okay, he blew it off to go do something else, but he'd come back for his sweater, but he never came back for his sweater, and he never heard from Duncan again. And so the parents, they have been searching all of Europe for a month, and they haven't talked to anybody who knew Duncan. They've gotten nowhere, and now they've just randomly stumbled on probably the last person to see Duncan before he went missing. And so they kept asking the instructor, give us more information. What was his attitude like? Was he stressed out? Was he scared? Was he worried about something? Where did he go? Give us anything. But the instructor really didn't have that much more information to offer. And so he tried to answer all their questions, but really just finally said, look, I'm sorry. All I know is after we ate lunch together on the 9th, Duncan said he was going to go out and do some practice runs, but I never actually saw him go up. I didn't see him come down. I just assumed he went up there and was kind of on his own for the day. And then, of course, the next day, I didn't see him and he never came back. And so I'm sorry. That's all I know. And so the parents finally said, thank you so much for the information. Please get in touch with us if you remember anything. And the instructor said he would. And then after that, the parents made their way to their room and they went to bed. The next morning, the parents got up early and they headed to that parking lot where Duncan's car was. And there were all these people, police officers and volunteers that were there to be a part of this big search party. And so after the parents explained to the leaders of the search party what the instructor had told them, that very likely their son had been up at the Stubai Glacier ski resort when he went missing, the entire search party quickly hopped on gondolas and made their way up there. And all day, this search party combed this glacier up and down. They walked all around to the backside of this mountain. They rappelled down cliffs and they hiked all over this entire segment of the mountain, but nobody found anything that gave away where Duncan had gone. And the next day, it was the same story. Huge search party looking everywhere, expanding the search, not just Stubai Glacier, but basically all over this entire swath of mountain range, but still, they found nothing. And so, at the end of the second day, the authorities went up to Duncan's parents and they told them that, unfortunately, we can't continue this search. We're calling it off. But Duncan's parents, they didn't call off the search. They continued searching for another 14 years. And over that time frame, they went back to Stubai Glacier over and over and over again. They searched it up and down. They knew all the staff members. They knew all the nooks and crannies of the entire place. But they never found any sign of their son. Fast forward to July of 2003, so 14 years after Duncan had gone missing, and a Stubai Glacier ski resort employee was riding the tow rope towards the top of the mountain when they noticed there was a bright yellow piece of trash right in the middle of the slope. And so the employee rode the tow rope just a little bit higher, and then he let go and skied down to this yellow thing. He reached down and he began pulling on this piece of yellow, and suddenly he stopped. And absolutely horrified, he realized this was not trash. While no one knows for sure what happened to Duncan, here is the leading theory that Duncan's family and authorities, for the most part, agree on. Back on August 9th, 1989, after having lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan was feeling motivated to go back out and take some practice runs. And so he headed outside, he looked up at the glacier, there's all this fog rolling in, but it's not raining, and so nobody's on the slope, and so it's perfect for a beginner. He's going to have this place to himself. And so he grabs his board, he makes his way over to the tow rope, he straps in, he grabs onto a bar, and he makes his way to the top. Once he gets off, he makes his way over to the start of the run, he puts his other foot into his binding, he makes sure he's all set, and then he stood up and began slowly kind of waffling his way down the completely vacant and very foggy slope. And as he was going along, he got more and more confident and began going a little bit faster and a little bit faster, until finally he was basically just bombing it down the mountain, relying on his natural balance and strength to kind of keep him up. And then all of a sudden, he caught an edge and flipped forward and smashed into the ground, and when he did, he broke his leg. The unique danger to humans when it comes to glaciers is something called a crevasse. basically cracks form in the ice, and sometimes these cracks can be massive, like mind-bogglingly massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet, that if you fall into this thing, you're done. No one's getting you out of there. You are falling either to your death, or you're falling so far down that no one can get to you. Or, like in the case of Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, they had the issue of little crevasses forming kind of all over the place. Especially if it rained, the rain would begin to crack the ice, or if maybe it was warmer than usual, the ice would crack here and there. And so the resort was really good about constantly patrolling their slope to make sure no crevasses had formed anywhere on the slope. And so when you got to Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, you were warned that there is such a thing as a crevasse. This is a real glacier, so make sure you're looking around and don't fall into one. Well, because it had rained, a crevasse had formed, a small one, like a pothole, in the slope, but because it was so foggy because of the rain, as Duncan was bombing down, he didn't see it, and that's what he caught his edge on, causing him to fall and break his leg. And so Duncan, he's now stranded in the middle of the slope. He's not close enough to the bottom to where he could pull himself into the resort. He's not close enough to the top where he could get himself up there and talk to the tow lift operator. And so he's just kind of stranded. There's nobody on the mountain. It's so foggy, nobody can see him from the resort. And so he's just stuck in agonizing pain, wondering what he's supposed to do. At the same time this was happening, another ski resort employee was climbing into one of those big snowcat tractors at the top of the glacier. These tractors were what the resort used to chop the top layer of ice and turn it into snow. And because it had rained that day, a lot of the snow had melted, and so this employee needed to basically go over the entire slope from top to bottom and grind up the ice and make some new snow. And so the employee hopped in the cab of this tractor, shut the door, turned on the engine, turned on the back rake, which in your head, picture a long stretch of metal dragging behind this tractor that had rotating blades that cut into the snow as it moved along. And so this employee, after turning on the rake and making sure everything worked, they drove the snowcat and the rake onto the start of the downward slope, and they began crisscrossing back and forth across the entire slope, turning it all into fresh snow. And as this employee drove, they were very careful not to go too quick because they knew they couldn't see very far with all of the fog. And so they're going like 1 or 2 miles an hour, being very cautious. And then suddenly, at the last second, they see something in the snow. It kind of appeared out of the fog. And so the employees swerved as fast as they could to avoid hitting it. And they did narrowly miss it. Their big tank-like treads that are on these tractors just missed running this thing over. However, the back rake with the rotating blades did not miss this object. It went right over it. The employee immediately parked the snowcat and then leapt outside and ran over to see what this thing was. And when they got there, they could not believe what they saw. It was Duncan, and all those rotating blades that had crossed over him had basically mutilated him. One of his arms had been cut off, one of his legs was nearly cut off, but it's believed Duncan was actually not dead. The injuries were horrible, but they would not necessarily have killed him outright. He would bleed to death without help, but in theory, he could have been saved. But the employee, even though this was a total accident, totally panicked and decided that because it was so foggy, no one must have seen this. No one was around, and so no one would know that they were the ones who ran this guy over. And so instead of helping Duncan, they just tied him up and dragged him behind the snowcat off of the glacier over to this area where this employee knew there was a very deep crevasse. And they chucked Duncan, who might have been alive at this point, into the crevasse along with his arm and his severed leg. And then the employee used the snowcat tractor to rake over the crevasse. They filled it all in and packed it down. And then they drove down the rest of the way and just hoped no one would ever know. But over the course of the next 14 years, the glacier would melt more and more each year until finally Duncan's yellow jacket popped through the ice. And that's what the resort employees saw as they were going up the tow lift and thought it was trash. It was actually Duncan's jacket. They skied over, they tried to pull it out of the snow, only to then see, literally in the ice, Duncan McPherson looking right back up at them. and Duncan still looked like he was 23 years old because he had been frozen this entire time. According to the Stubai Glacier ski resort, Duncan must have just fallen into this crevasse and died. That's what they say happened, and some authorities say that is what happened. But when they pulled Duncan out of the ice and they found his body had been chopped apart and his snowboard had even been chopped apart, that told a very different story. As for the snowcat driver who drove over Duncan, they were never actually officially identified or charged with any crime because there was a statute of limitations that had run out by 2003. And so no one has ever been held accountable for Duncan's death.